And I rise today to speak about a critical subject too often overlooked by Congress. It's the federal debt and our deficit. It's no secret that our national debt will soon surpass $20 trillion. Now, to provide some context for that figure, $20 trillion represents the largest amount of debt ever owned by any nation in history. This fact, coupled with a fast approaching end to our fiscal year, will leave Congress facing an unavoidable debt debate. Now, our looming debt and deficit is one of our country's most urgent challenges, but the legislative branch does not treat it like the crisis that it really is. Since January alone, Congress has added $284 billion to the debt over the next 10 years. The Congressional Budget Office recently projected that if Congress continues on its current path, deficits will increase dramatically over the next decade. Specifically, by 2017, the deficit will grow from 3.6% of the nation's GDP to 5.2% of the nation's GDP, totaling $1.4 trillion. Yet, as the national debt clock continues to click upward, toward $20 trillion, the federal government continues to spend money that it simply doesn't have. If Congress continues to legislate in this current state of denial, one day soon, we may well wake up to discover the financial markets have declared that the United States is no longer a good bet. We must also remember Congress's failure to address this fiscal train wreck today will force our children and grandchildren to deal with its consequences tomorrow. So unless Congress can get this fundamental issue under control, nothing else will matter very much. That's why there ought to be an option that allows taxpayers to take the matters into their own hands. That's why today I'm reintroducing the Debt Buy-Down Act. The Debt Buy-Down Act is a common-sense bill that allows taxpayers to rein in the national debt with the simple check of a box. If passed, this bill will require the IRS to include an option on an individual's tax form, allowing them to voluntarily designate up to 10% of their tax liability to go specifically toward reducing the national debt. The bill would then require Congress to reduce federal spending by an amount equivalent to that designated by taxpayers. If Congress fails to make these necessary spending reductions designated by taxpayers, then across-the-board spending cuts would be imposed. This is not a good way to reduce the federal debt. The better way would be to make priorities as we consider our spending bills. But it's better than just letting these spending bills go and doing nothing. We ought to use a scalpel and go in and treat these programs as we should and make sure that they're doing what they were intended to. But if we can't do that, then we need to take dramatic measures to get our debt and deficit under control. The Debt Buy-Down Act would protect Social Security benefits, benefits for those in uniformed services, payments for net interest on the national debt from being included in any of these across-the-board cuts. Simply put, the absence of responsible federal budget solutions, in the absence of these responsible federal budget solutions, this bill allows taxpayers to take matters into their own hands. In 2014, Americans paid over $1.37 trillion in individual income taxes. If every one of these individuals contributed 10% of their tax liability, Congress would be required to cut $137 billion in spending. And while $137 billion does not solve our $20 trillion debt problem, it's certainly a good place to start. Now, Congress has been so desensitized to the growing national debt that the word trillion doesn't even raise alarm bells anymore. In fact, after I introduced the Debt Buy-Down Act in 2010, I began sending a weekly pun-laden press release to help put the $13 trillion, just in 2010, $13 trillion national debt into perspective. It was called, So Just How Broke Are We? And maybe it's time to bring it back. So 7 years and $7 trillion in added debt later, just how broke are we today? We're so broke that with our $20 trillion national debt, we could book 570,000 trips to the moon on SpaceX. It's a pretty expensive incursion, but we could do it 570,000 times. We are so broke that with our $20 trillion national debt, we could buy every seat at Chase Field in Phoenix for the next 22 million Arizona Diamondbacks games. Of course, that's just a ballpark figure, but that's the last pun, I promise. We're so broke that with our $20 trillion national debt, we could buy 20 billion tickets to see Hamilton. But my love of bad puns and jokes aside, instead of thinking about how $20 trillion could be spent, maybe we ought to start thinking about how $20 trillion could be saved. That's why I'm calling on my colleagues to support the Debt Buy-Down Act to empower taxpayers to reduce the national debt. Just think, a simple check of the box would help save billions of dollars and preserve the strength of our national economy. It would save future generations from the consequences of our crippling national debt. At any rate, I hope that this bill makes like the debt and it grows a lot of interest. Thank you, Mr. President.